Hey guys, welcome back for our week 6 video lecture. Today we are going to begin talking about John F. Kennedy's presidency, and that's going to be the topic really for the entire week of video lectures. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So our first slide, the 35th President of the United States. On a chilly day in Washington, D.C., a large crowd gathered in front of the Capitol to watch John F. Kennedy be sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. These are some of his words that he said on that day. Let the word go forth from this time and place that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by the hard and bitter peace. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. That was said on January 20th, 1961. Again, just from listening to those immortal words, you can see why so many people really adored Kennedy. His charisma was off the charts. So, next slide, JFK. The young president's dedication to the ideal of liberty touched the hearts and minds of many Americans, most Americans, you could make the argument for. Kennedy closed his address by appealing to his audience and their sense of idealism, urging Americans to personally commit to public service. One of his most famous quotes is here. And so, my fellow Americans, I ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Just a fantastic ideal, right? Let's make our country as strong as it can be together. Ask what you as an individual can do to make your country better. I think that's something we should all strive for. Okay, so Elvis and Roosevelt. Imagine taking Elvis Presley and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and putting them together, right? So this great liberal progressive with all the style and charisma of a rock star. That starts to get you close to what JFK was. Kennedy's dazzling inaugural festivities included obviously his inaugural address, but there was also a ball. He established a tone of elegance and youthful vigor, and this became known as the Kennedy style. Kennedy really changes the image of the modern president. How a president is supposed to look, how a president is supposed to act. Again, we're going to talk more about this, especially as we get into kind of the first televised debates and how Kennedy was able to really capitalize on the way he looked and the way he presented himself. Right, very, very different from his predecessors. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Kennedy advocates for more weapons. Now, Kennedy is running against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the vice president of Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was a wildly popular president. Again, remember, back to World War II, he was the Allied commander of all forces. So his name is well known. He is well respected. Richard Nixon aims to turn that relationship into a presidential run for himself. Kennedy has an uphill battle. There's no doubt about it. But one of the things that Kennedy uses as a talking point is that he believes Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon have allowed for there to be this missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States, arguing that we have not produced nearly enough arms to keep up with the Soviets' production. And he hammered this point over and over and over and over again. And it really stuck with the American people. Most American voters, when they went to the ballot box that year, were thinking how Eisenhower and Nixon hadn't allowed us to maintain pace with the Soviets. So therefore, they felt like a new leader was necessary at that time. In reality, not only was there not a missile gap, the missile gap was between the Soviet Union and us. We were outproducing them in every measurable metric. But again, in the game of politics, Kennedy, with his charisma, with his style, was able to convince the American voters that he was ultimately the better choice. Okay, moving on to the next slide. TV changes politics forever. I think if you turn on any news outlet today, you're going to get some politics involved. That wasn't always the case. In fact, politics and the news, or rather the television, didn't really mix. They never mixed, in fact. But on September 26th, 1960, that all changed. You had President Kennedy and who would become President Kennedy and Vice President Nixon squaring off in a debate. Now, more than 70 million viewers tuned in to watch the debate. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. What was so interesting about this debate is the difference in opinion depending on the medium in which you watched it or listened to it. If you watched on TV, you thought Kennedy won that debate. Kennedy was wearing makeup. He was clean shaven. His suit was tailored. He looked every bit the president. Now, if you watched on TV and you were looking at Nixon, you thought Nixon didn't look the part. Nixon came in with a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow, refused to wear makeup. Without wearing makeup, the lights on the stage kind of gave him this odd, pale appearance. Now, on the inverse of that, those who listened to the debate thought that Nixon won the debate easily. Nixon was much sharper when it came to policy points. They felt like he was certainly the candidate to support. Now, if you look at the election of 1960 and you see the electoral map, you can see just how split the country was. All right. Again, this is one of the closest presidential elections really since 1888. Kennedy barely defeated Nixon. As a result, Kennedy took office without a clear electoral mandate, meaning the nation as a whole didn't really give Kennedy carte blanche to do whatever he wanted, but he would inhabit the White House, right? So Camelot comes to D.C. Next slide. The best and the brightest. Like the legendary King Arthur, Kennedy wanted to surround himself with the best and the brightest. Advisors that he would bring in would include advisors such as McGeorge Bundy. He would also bring in a top flight Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. One of the odder choices he did make, though, was for his Attorney General. He would actually choose his brother, Robert Kennedy, to be his Attorney General. And we'll talk more about Robert Kennedy as we move through in the next couple of weeks. Okay, next slide. Tackling civil rights. Obviously, the 1960s are defined by the civil rights era, and we're going to talk much more about the civil rights era in Vietnam next week. But I just want to introduce Kennedy's foray into the civil rights era. Kennedy had very little success passing civil rights legislation in Congress. It was a tough fight for him. During his campaign, Kennedy called for an end to racial discrimination. He responded to Atlanta authorities, jailing Martin Luther King Jr. by asking his brother Robert to arrange King's release. Widely reported in the press, news of his brother's efforts on King's behalf helped Kennedy secure the African American vote. He is trying to get landmark legislation passed. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be until after his death that we would see that. Okay. Next slide. Kennedy takes aim for the stars, literally. Kennedy's most exciting new frontier challenge was space exploration. Okay. In 1957, the Soviet Union surprised the world by launching the first artificial satellite into orbit. This satellite was known as Sputnik, or Little Traveler in Russian. This scared the United States quite a bit. The USSR would also launch a Sputnik 2 a month later with a dog on board. And you can see both of those images there. Sputnik 1 at the top, Sputnik 2 at the bottom. Okay, next slide. To the moon. In 1958, President Eisenhower responded to the Soviet challenge by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA. I'm sure we all know about NASA today. And this is what he said. I believe that this nation should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Right? Kennedy is setting his sights on the moon literally. Now, although Kennedy would not live to see this vision come to reality, it would come to pass. NASA worked rapidly to achieve this goal. In 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard completed a short space flight. A year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. On July 20th, 1969, 8 years after Kennedy declared the moon landing goal, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr. of the Apollo space program landed on the moon. The world watched in awe as Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface, declaring, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." All right, that wraps up our video lecture for Monday, April 27th. As always, stay well, stay healthy. I miss you guys, and hopefully I get to see you soon. Have a great day. Bye.